The hardest lesson I learned on the farm. Part 1. I still remember the first morning when everything changed for me. The air was heavy with the smell of wet soil, the kind of scent that only comes after a night of rain. The fields around the farmhouse shimmered under the rising sun, droplets clinging to every blade of grass. To anyone else, it might have looked peaceful, even beautiful. But for me, that morning felt like the start of a trial I wasn't sure I could survive. I had grown up around the farm, but I was never really responsible for running it. My father and grandfather had always carried the weight, while I did the easy chores, feeding the chickens, carrying water, sweeping the barn floor. But on that day, my father had to leave early to handle paperwork in town, and my grandfather was bedridden with aching joints. That left me, barely 17 and still unsure of myself, to take care of the farm on my own. "You'll manage," my father had said before leaving, his tone calm, but his eyes sharp. "The cows need milking, the hay has to be turned before the sun gets too hot, and don't forget to check the fence by the north pasture. Yesterday I noticed it was sagging. If the cows get out..." He didn't finish the sentence, but I could see the seriousness in his face. I nodded, trying to look confident, but inside I was already nervous. I wasn't sure I could keep up with all the tasks. A farm isn't forgiving. Animals don't wait, fields don't wait, and problems rarely come one at a time. The first task was the milking. The cows were restless, lowing loudly when I walked into the barn. Normally, my father would calm them with his deep, steady voice, and my grandfather would pat their sides like old friends. But when I stepped inside, the cows seemed to sense my uncertainty. Their hooves shuffled, tails flicked, and the air filled with the smell of hay and manure. I set up the stool and tried to start with Daisy, one of our older, gentler cows. I had seen my father do this countless times, his hands steady and sure. But when I reached out, Daisy shifted nervously. The bucket tipped, spilling water onto the floor. My hands shook as I tried again, and this time I pulled too hard. Daisy kicked back and I barely jumped away in time. My heart raced. I can't even milk one cow? How am I supposed to handle the whole farm today? After a few clumsy attempts, I finally managed to get a rhythm, though it was slow and uneven. Milk splattered the bucket instead of flowing neatly. By the time I finished with Daisy and moved on to the next, my arms already ached. The barn, which usually echoed with the calm sound of milk hitting metal, was now full of clattering buckets and my frustrated sighs. It took me twice as long as usual, but at last the milking was done. My shirt was damp with sweat, my hands sore, and my patience thinner than ever. Next came the hay. The storm from the night before had left the field damp, and if I didn't turn the hay, it would spoil. Spoiled hay meant no feed for the cows later, and that was not an option. I grabbed the pitchfork and trudged into the field. The sun was climbing higher, burning off the mist, and soon the air turned humid. I dug the fork into the hay, turning it row by row. At first, I tried to keep up a good pace, but the work was heavier than I imagined. Each forkful felt like lifting bricks. My arms and back screamed in protest, but I gritted my teeth and kept going. As I worked, sweat stung my eyes and blisters began to form on my palms. I wanted to stop, just for a moment, but the thought of my father's words pushed me forward. If the hay isn't ready, the cows will suffer. And if the cows suffer, the farm suffers. And if the farm suffers, we all do. By noon, the sun blazed overhead and I still hadn't finished. I forced myself up, telling myself I couldn't fail. My shirt clung to me, soaked through, and every step felt heavier. But somehow, one row at a time, I kept moving. When I finally finished the last row, I dropped the fork and leaned against the fence, my chest heaving. For a moment, I thought I might collapse right there, but then I remembered the fence itself was the next task. The north pasture fence had been sagging for weeks. Normally, my father would fix it with practiced ease, but now it was my responsibility. I carried a hammer, nails, and a few spare boards, trudging up the hill where the pasture stretched wide. When I reached it, my heart sunk. The fence wasn't just sagging, it had nearly fallen in one place. The wood was splintered, leaning outward, as if daring the cows to push against it. And sure enough, a few of them were already nosing the weak spot, curious. "Not today," I muttered, setting down the tools. But repairing a fence under the hot sun with sore muscles and little experience turned into a nightmare. Every board seemed heavier than the last. My hammer swings were clumsy, nails bent, and sweat ran down into my eyes. Meanwhile, the cows pressed closer, their weight against the fence growing stronger. At one point, one of the younger cows, Belle, I recognized her by the patch on her forehead, actually shoved hard enough that the fence creaked alarmingly. Panic shot through me. If they broke through, I'd never get them all back before nightfall. "Stay back," I shouted, waving my arms like that would help. Of course, the cows just blinked at me, unimpressed. My hands shook as I hammered the last board into place. Just as I finished, the wood splintered again, and for a moment, I thought the whole thing would collapse. But by some miracle, it held. I sagged against the fence, too tired to care that I was covered in dust and sweat. By the time the sun dipped toward the horizon, I had managed to complete the tasks. Barely. My body felt like it had been beaten with sticks, every muscle aching, every thought clouded by exhaustion. I walked back to the farmhouse, my boots heavy, my clothes soaked. For a moment, I thought about lying to my father when he asked how it went, pretending it had been easy. But deep down, I knew he would see the truth in my eyes. That night, as I sat on the porch watching the fields darken under the setting sun, I realized something. The farm didn't care about how tired I was. The cows didn't care if my hands hurt. The hay didn't care if the sun burned me. The farm demanded everything, and if I wasn't ready to give it, then I didn't deserve to be called a farmer. And yet, even after the hardest day of my young life, I felt a strange sense of pride. I had survived. I hadn't run away. I had done the work, even if it wasn't perfect. But little did I know, that day was only the beginning. The hardest lesson the farm had to teach me was still waiting. The next morning, I woke before dawn, muscles stiff, hands aching, and the soreness in my back reminded me of the previous day's toil. Somehow, despite all my exhaustion, I felt a strange mixture of dread and determination. The farm didn't wait, and today promised to be even more unforgiving. I had learned something important yesterday. The farm demanded respect and focus, and mistakes could be costly. But what I didn't realize was just how unpredictable farm life could be. The first task was feeding the animals. Chickens clucked and flapped as I poured feed into their troughs, pigs oinked from the mud, and the goats nudged each other, impatient for their breakfast. Everything seemed routine, until I noticed a movement near the edge of the barnyard. A young calf, a new one we had barely had time to name, had slipped out through the small gap in the fence I hadn't noticed. Panic surged. The calf was tiny, but surprisingly fast, darting across the muddy yard with a speed that seemed impossible. I ran after it, heart pounding, but the calf zigzagged, slipping under gates, over puddles, and around barrels. The other animals had already started reacting. Chickens squawked and scattered, pigs squealed and rolled in the mud, and the goats bleated in alarm. By the time I managed to corner the calf near the old apple tree, I was soaked in sweat and mud, my lungs burning. I scooped the little creature into my arms, hugging it tightly, as if sheer force of will could prevent it from slipping away again. After returning the calf safely to the pen, I realized the farm didn't reward just hard work. It demanded vigilance, awareness, and quick thinking. I couldn't just go through the motions. I had to anticipate every possible problem. Then came the fields. Yesterday's exhaustion had left me sore, but the crops didn't care. Corn needed weeding, the tomatoes required support, and the small patch of potatoes had begun sprouting too close together. I grabbed my tools and began the tedious work, bending over for hours under the rising sun. Hours passed, each movement a reminder of my aching muscles. At some point, I realized I hadn't taken a break. My stomach growled and my throat was parched, but I pushed forward. I told myself that breaks could wait. If the plants didn't get attention now, they might never recover. Around noon, dark clouds gathered overhead. The wind picked up, and the first drops of rain splattered on my skin. Normally, a little rain wouldn't have mattered, but the wind grew stronger, and soon the rain became a torrent. Mud formed around my boots, making every step slippery and uncertain. I was halfway through the cornfield when I heard it. A sudden, loud crack. My heart leapt into my throat. One of the old trees lining the edge of the field had been weakened by the storm, and now leaned dangerously, branches snapping under the wind's pressure. The sound echoed across the fields, startling the animals. Cows in the pasture began lowing, pigs squealed, and chickens clucked frantically. I ran toward the tree, slipping in the mud, and managed to get to the fence just as a large branch crashed down, narrowly missing the pasture gate. The sight sent a shiver down my spine. If the branch had fallen differently, the fence could have been destroyed, and the cows might have escaped again. After catching my breath, I assessed the rest of the field. The storm was worsening, and I had to make a decision. Either try to finish the crops now in the rain, or run to the barn and secure the animals first. I chose the animals. It was instinct. Priority one, life, not crops. I ran to the pasture and began herding the cows back toward the barn. Easier said than done. The younger cows, scared by the storm, darted unpredictably. One of them, a stubborn black and white calf, refused to follow the others. I chased it across the mud, slipping repeatedly, until finally I managed to corner it at the corner of the barn. By the time all the cows were safely inside, I was drenched, exhausted, and shivering, but there was no time to rest. I still had to make sure the barn doors were secured and all animals had water. Pigs were squealing, chickens were frantic, and the goats had managed to get into the feed storage, tipping over bags and scattering grain across the floor. It felt like the farm was testing me, throwing every challenge it could think of at once, and I was barely holding on. Even as I worked to clean up the mess inside, I realized a bigger problem. The fence along the north pasture had been weakened further by the storm. I had fixed it yesterday, but the wind and rain had undone some of my effort. If it broke completely, the cows could escape again, and I couldn't risk that. I grabbed my hammer and some spare boards, heading out into the storm. The rain lashed my face, and the wind threatened to push me off balance. Each board I nailed into place felt heavier than the last, my hands slipping, nails bending. The cows, now calm in the barn, occasionally peeked through the windows, as if watching my struggle. At one point, a particularly strong gust ripped a board partially from my hands. I stumbled backward, nearly falling into the mud, and cursed under my breath. My muscles screamed, my gloves were soaked, and the cold rain bit through my clothes. But somehow, piece by piece, I managed to reinforce the fence. By late afternoon, I was exhausted beyond words. My clothes were soaked, my body ached, and I could barely lift my arms. And yet, looking at the farm, I felt something I hadn't expected. Pride. I had survived a full day of chaos, storms, and panic. The farm had demanded everything, and somehow I had given it. And then, as if the farm sensed I was reflecting, another challenge appeared. The piglets, curious and mischievous, had found a way to escape their pen. I watched them scurry into the muddy yard, squealing and running in all directions. I groaned, standing up, mud dripping from my boots, knowing that the night ahead would not be easy. But deep down, I also knew I had learned something vital. No matter how difficult the farm could be, I could face it. I could survive its chaos. I could grow. And yet, even with this hard-won confidence, I sensed that the farm had more lessons in store for me, lessons I was not yet ready to understand. The next morning, the farm felt different. After the storm, there was a strange calm, the fields sparkling with fresh rain, the earth smelling rich and clean. But I knew better than to think that the calm meant peace. The farm always demanded attention, always had its surprises, and today I was about to face the hardest lesson yet. I started with the animals. The piglets from yesterday were still energetic and mischievous, squealing as they raced around the pen. I managed to herd them back, securing their gate with extra nails this time. Chickens clucked quietly, perhaps sensing that the storm had passed and that things would return to their routine. The cows were calm, grazing slowly in the pasture, but even in their calm there was tension, an unspoken reminder that nothing on a farm could ever be taken for granted. My father had returned the evening before, but he didn't interfere. He simply watched me as I went about my work, his eyes thoughtful. I could sense his approval, though, and it gave me a strange boost of confidence. But I knew this day would test me in ways that my father's quiet observation couldn't prepare me for. The hardest task awaited: repairing the irrigation system. The storm had damaged the main water lines, and if I didn't fix them quickly, the crops would suffer. I had seen my father do this countless times, adjusting valves, tightening pipes, and testing water pressure. But doing it myself was a different matter. I knelt in the muddy trench, trying to align the pipes, my hands slick with rain and mud. The water pressure was uneven, and each turn of the wrench felt like it required twice the strength I had. At one point, a pipe burst, spraying me head to toe with cold water. I shouted in frustration, slipping in the mud, but forced myself to focus. Each mistake taught me something new: how to hold the wrench, how to anticipate the pressure, how to stay calm under chaos. Hours passed, and the sun climbed high. Sweat and mud coated me, my back a constant ache, but slowly, pipe by pipe, valve by valve, the irrigation system began to function again. Water flowed evenly into the fields, soaking the soil and nourishing the crops. I stepped back, exhausted, and for a moment, I allowed myself to feel proud. I had fixed it. But pride was short-lived. As I turned toward the barn, I noticed something alarming. A corner of the north pasture fence had weakened again. One of the cows had pushed it just enough to create a gap. I ran, mud slapping against my boots, and reinforced it with whatever materials I could find. It was during this frantic work that I realized the farm wasn't about one perfect day or one perfect solution. It was about constant attention, responsibility, and learning from mistakes. Every task was connected. Every misstep could create a chain reaction. The afternoon brought another challenge. While checking the barns, I noticed one of the young goats trapped under a fallen beam.
Its legs were pinned, and it bleated in terror. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. Carefully, I lifted the beam, straining every muscle, my heart racing. The goat scrambled free and ran toward the pen, trembling but unharmed. This incident, more than any other, taught me the weight of responsibility. The animals depended on me, not just for food or safety, but for their very lives. A moment of carelessness could have catastrophic consequences. As I moved through the farm, repairing, feeding, and checking, I began to notice small details I had missed before. The way the chickens preferred certain corners of the coop, the way the cows reacted to the wind, the subtle signs in the soil that indicated dryness or disease. Slowly, I began to understand that the farm was a teacher in the smallest details, not just the big dramatic challenges. Evening came and I was exhausted beyond measure. My clothes were mud-stained, my hands raw, and my body a symphony of aches. Yet, as I stood on the porch, watching the sunset paint the fields gold and crimson, a profound sense of accomplishment filled me. I had faced the farm's relentless demands, survived storms, mishaps, and my own inexperience. And I had learned. The lesson wasn't just about hard work. It was about vigilance, responsibility, patience, and respect for life itself. Every mistake was a teacher. Every challenge an opportunity to grow. The farm had pushed me to the brink, and in doing so, it had shaped me into someone stronger, more capable, and more aware of the delicate balance between nature, labor, and life. I thought back to that first morning, the nervous boy, unsure if he could manage the milking, the hay, the fence. That boy had grown. The farm hadn't made it easy, but it had made me. That night, as I prepared for bed, I reflected on the weeks to come. There would be more storms, more broken fences, more animals testing my limits. But now, I understood that each challenge was not a punishment, it was a lesson, and I was ready to meet it head-on, armed with the knowledge, experience, and resilience I had earned. I lay down, muscles aching, body exhausted, but mind at peace. The farm was still demanding, unpredictable, and unforgiving, but it was also alive, vibrant, and full of lessons for those willing to learn. And I, for the first time, felt that I was ready. The hardest lesson I learned on the farm wasn't about strength or skill alone. It was about understanding responsibility, respecting life, and embracing the challenges that come with both. I had been tested, pushed to my limits, and I had survived. And as the moon rose over the fields, casting silver light on the barn and pastures, I knew that I would never forget the lessons of those days. I had learned what it truly meant to be a farmer, not just to work the land, but to live in harmony with it, to understand its demands, and to grow alongside it. It was hard, it was exhausting, it was sometimes terrifying, but it was worth every moment.
Thanks for watching. Don't miss the next story.